Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Let's pick up where we left off. We were talking about different theories of possible worlds. So we had gone through and critiqued the conceptualist theory of worlds, which tries to understand possibility just in terms of concepts in the mind. A problem with that is that you seem to need some kind of universal conceptualizer like God to make that work. And there was a combinatorial theory. That one says that non-actual worlds are possible combinations of fundamental building blocks that exist in the actual world. So unicorns as possible beings would be possible arrangements of actual particles into a unicorn structure. That one could run into trouble if you allowed for the possibility of worlds with more or different basic entities. Like a world with alien, unfamiliar basic particles, or a world with Cartesian souls, assuming you don't have any in the actual world. Everyone tracking with me here? Any questions about it? No. Yeah, and then there was the abstract worlds theory. So that one seems to be committed to a rich ontology of abstract propositional entities or abstract properties. So on that theory, a possible world is either a very complex property that could be exemplified. The actual world would then be some very complex property which is exemplified. Or it could be a very long conjunction of propositions or states of affairs, possible states of affairs. So according to this theory, only actual items have any reality. Other possible universes containing possible beings and such are hypothetical. So they could exist, but they don't actually exist. What exists are these propositions, propositions about them. So there are false propositions about unicorns that exist, and these are abstract entities. So we're not saying that everything is in the mind, because these propositions are supposed to exist extramentally as abstract beings. Nor are we saying that everything has to be constructed out of basic building blocks. Some of these propositions could concern items that can't be constructed out of any physical basic building blocks, like Cartesian minds or something like that.
So you could say abstract substance.
Abstract substance?
In other words, these are things that are still substance, even though they're abstract. They're not just related to mind.
Well, yeah, they're not mind dependent. It doesn't necessarily make them substances in the sense of being physical objects. Or something like that, in that sense.
Okay.
But yeah, they're more in another sense of substance.
They're entities.
They're beings. Yeah. So in common discourse, a substance is an entity that's concrete and has certain defining marks, like the ability to undergo change, intrinsic change. And, generally, it has either physical or at least mental qualities. These propositions aren't like that. They're abstract realities. But they're held to be beings in themselves, which can exist apart from the mind. So that distinguishes it from the conceptual theory.
Conceptual.
It's also different than the combinational theory because there might be propositions about things that are not made up out of basic physical building blocks in the actual world, like souls and like particles that don't exist in our world, and so on. Okay, so that's your abstract worlds theory. So on this theory, worlds aren't actual places you could visit. They're abstract models of possible realities that could exist.
So what's this world?
This world is a unique world that's actual. So the beings in
Only actual world?
yeah, it's the only actual world. Yeah. It's the only world that obtains. The others possibly obtain but don't.
Is it the only actual world because we experience it?
No,
and know
it's the only actual world because it's the one that is exemplified or which obtains.
So exemplified and which obtains is keywords to that?
Yeah. Yeah. If you think of a world as a very rich property, then it's the only world property that is exemplified. If you think of it more as a propositional thing, which is more natural for me anyway, then you're talking about the only one of the possible worlds which obtains. Now, other worlds may have certain parts that obtain, but they don't obtain overall. Right?
What would that look like?
Well, it would just be like they resemble this world a lot, but there's some differences.
Okay.
Like the only difference is that there's a frog on this desk right now. But other than that, it's all exactly the same. So that world's going to look a lot like the actual world. But there's one thing in it that makes it overall not obtain or not be exemplified, that frog, because that doesn't actually exist.
It's like, see the difference between these two photos, and it's like one detail?
Yeah, one detail's enough to make that world not actual.
Not actual.
Yeah, but it's still fully possible.
So these worlds are possible, but they're not actual. So within them being possible are just abstract worlds, or like what's the?
Yeah, they're abstract. Yeah,
Okay,
as
because
a
they're
whole.
abstract because they are possible and not
But
actual.
because they're merely possible. Yeah. Yeah, the actual world is possible, but it's also obtains, which makes it actual. Yeah.
And so these worlds, I'm just trying to understand better. So
Yeah.
these worlds are possible insofar that they're not like logically impossible.
Right.
Like a
Yeah.
triangular, like they can't have a triangular sphere.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not just like a world where like I don't want to say anything can happen, but like logical inconsistency.
They can't happen, but anything else can.
Okay.
Oh, so they don't have logical consistency as
No.
well?
No. If they had like round spherical cubes in them and stuff, then they'd be they're impossible.
Yeah.
So they're not possible worlds. Yeah. So anything we can consistently imagine will exist in some other world, but it doesn't actually exist. Okay, so now we go to the concrete worlds theory, and that was basically put forward by David Lewis initially. So he suggests that Leibniz may have had something like this in mind. It's hard to confirm that. According to Lewis, possible worlds are concrete entities, and all the things in them exist, though they're not actual. The concrete things in the other worlds exist just as much as the things in this world do. They're just not actual because by actual we mean the things that exist in our world. But there are the people who exist in these other worlds are real flesh and blood people, and they believe that their world is the actual world, and they're not wrong, because what they mean is the world in which I'm located contains all these things, and that's true. So actuality for Lewis is sort of like an indexical term, like this or that. It's pointing to something. So there's only one actual world from our point of view. That's our world. But the other points of view are just as real.
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, there's only one actual world from our point of view. That's the world that we're in. That's what we mean by actual, the world we're in. But people who live in these other worlds, the other possible worlds, because there are people there too, they're not just abstract entities or anything. They're actual people like us. They exist in these separate worlds. None of the worlds can ever communicate with each other.
But they're both still concrete.
Yeah, they're all concrete. They're made of concrete things, not out of properties or relations or propositions or something like that. Made of actual flesh and blood people and creatures and rocks and stones and stuff like that. So each one is a universe unto itself.
Would Kant say that these are things that are beyond knowing, the unknowable, even though they're concrete worlds?
Well, that's a good question. We seem to be able to say some things about them, so they don't seem to be totally unknowable.
Unknowable.
They're not unknowable, even though we can't causally interact with them. We seem to be able to say like what's in some of them and what's not in some of them. Right, there are no round squares in any of those worlds.
So that's no.
And there are other people just like us, except for one detail or another. There's something just like this table, except it has a frog on it, one of these other ones, and so on. So it seems like
But does
we know to a large extent what's in them, but not total.
But we couldn't say they obtained though.
No, because they're concrete things, though. We can say that they exist, however, right? They exist. Yeah.
So what about, okay, if both of these worlds are concrete, our world and this other
Yeah.
possible world.
Right, with a frog. Yeah.
Right. Would we still exist on the same spatio-temporal
No, we're in
plane?
separate space-time continuums.
So that world can also exist like 5 minutes in the past, and that could be the one difference between us?
Yeah.
Time.
Uh-huh. Or your time could run more quickly or more slowly there, all kinds of stuff.
So all of our judgments are kind of like just based off of what we can claim on our immediate world. So
Yeah.
like, to claim that like that world's 5 minutes in the past, I'm sure that on their world they would claim that our world is 5 minutes in the future.
Yes.
So it's all relative from our perspective on
Yes.
our world. Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So you said, I believe you said that those in the other concrete worlds, the other possible worlds, they cannot interact with other worlds. And so
No, we can't travel there and they can't travel here.
Yeah, they can't. We can't travel there. They can't travel here. But I understand that we can make some judgments about
Yeah.
them from here. From
We
where
can.
are.
Yeah.
So is it possible that if someone is that we can judge that there's another world where they are able to go to other worlds, but just not this world? And so would that mean that they
No.
can make judgments about
No,
their world?
that's not one of the things that could, that's one of those impossible things, like a round square.
And why is that impossible? I don't know if I'm being like obtuse or anything.
Well, because that's the whole like nature of possibility that he's explaining, and one of his axioms is that individuals like you and I are world bound. The abstract theory allows the same individual literally to exist in infinitely many worlds. So there's a world in which you're sitting there now, then there's which is the actual world, and there's a world in which you're sitting in the next chair over, which is a merely possible world, and you exist in both of those worlds, and in a third world, and a fourth world, and so on. But on the Lewis view, since you're talking about concrete individual things making up these worlds, you can only be in one, the one that you're in. So if we say that if we say that it's possible for you not to be sitting there now on Lewis's theory,
Yeah.
that's going to come out false. It's not going to be possible for you to be not sitting there, which seems excessively necessitarian, because it means that every dated truth about what's happening to a thing at a particular time necessarily is true about that individual at that time. So it means that none of us could have been sitting in a different chair here today than the one we chose to sit in. Though we could change our seat now, that'd be fine. But we couldn't have sat in the seat instead that the other person's.
At the same time.
No, at the time in question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're sitting in the seat you're in right now, you're necessarily sitting in that seat that you're in right now. And that seems wrong. So Lewis says we have to redefine the notion of necessary and accidental property to make it come out right on his theory. So what he says is that you have a property necessarily only if every counterpart of yours has it in every alternate world. So your essence your necessary nature becomes a function not just of what properties you have in the actual world, but also of what alternative properties your counterparts could have had in other worlds. So if there's a world in which there's somebody just like you sitting in a different chair right now, then you're sitting in the chair you're in right now is merely a contingent property or accidental property of you, according to his definition. A necessary or essential property must meet the following condition, according to Lewis. You have it, and every counterpart of yours always has it. Then it'll be a necessary property. So he says all your counterparts will say have the property of being embodied in an animal body. So why? Because if they became so different that they weren't embodied in an animal body, then they'd be so dissimilar that we couldn't possibly identify you with them.
It wouldn't be you.
It wouldn't be you because it's so dissimilar, right? So he says it's got to have a certain degree of similarity to you to be you. It becomes too different, then it's just not you. It's not one of your counterparts anymore. It's somebody else's, or something else's counterpart.
Spherical cube.
Yeah, well, counterpart of a table or something like that, right? Not a counterpart of a human. Yeah.
So, I'm sorry if he's looking at that question, but, so this, according to this theory, so would that mean that it's not possible for there to be another world where there's the world where I exist here, but there's another world where I don't exist?
Yeah, there's lots of worlds where you don't exist.
Okay.
Matter of fact, you don't exist in any other world except this one.
Okay.
Who exists are these counterparts of yours. Okay. But in a broader sense, yeah, you exist in other worlds. You exist, so to speak, in the worlds in which you have counterparts. But there'll be some worlds where you have no counterparts at all.
There are entities that have meanness in their world?
Yeah, because they're similar enough to you to be like your doppelganger in the other world. Your representative in the other world. Yeah.
It seems like Lewis's view begs the question a little bit. Is that because it seems like, so in order to, the necessary properties of you or anything, depend on its similarities with the counterparts.
Yeah.
But you must be able to like identify the counterparts.
Yeah.
And so it seems like you already have to have those necessary properties in mind. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah.
It seems like it begs the question a little.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say also that it seems to invert the proper relation of data to theory. I mean, if you stick with the intuitive idea, it's not, when you think you could have been sitting in a different chair when you came into the class today instead of the one that you picked, you're not thinking that your counterpart could have, you're thinking that you, right?
Right.
Could have selected a different chair to sit in. And so if you stick with that notion, it turns out that the theory is excessively necessitarian. It implies that we have all these necessary properties that we don't think we have. So then Lewis says, okay, well, I'm going to change the notion, redefine the notions of necessary and contingent properties. Instead of saying it's a property I could elect, I'm going to say it's a property a counterpart of mine could have lacked, right? Or a property that my counterparts all have, right? Instead of a property that I always have. But the theory is supposed to do justice to the data. It's not like we have to change our concepts to fit with his theory.
Right. Right. You can't manipulate.
Well, why should we toss out the data because it doesn't fit his theory? Why not just say his theory is mistaken since it gives the wrong result?
Yeah, I was wondering if
Yeah,
we
so
were to land
I
on
don't
a
go
different
with this.
planet, if we were to land on a different planet
Yeah.
that was like a different world, and then we found that it was like pretty similar to ours and like a
Yeah.
lot of like similarities to the point that there was the
Right.
you said that there's a degree of similarity from D to U. Imagine if we found that there was a degree of similarity. Would that say that his theory is incorrect because he says that you can't, that you're bound to the world? But since we have technology that allows us to move to different worlds, is it that we're bound to our universe, or is it just bound to our world?
Well, by world, he means the universe.
Okay, that's good.
He doesn't mean your planet.
Right.
So what if we were able to, like,
But you could ask, why are people, what if we found a world exactly like ours, another planet exactly like counter-Earth out there? I mean, you could ask, like, why aren't those counterparts too? But, right?
the planets?
Those people are duplicates, like on these other planets or in other dimensions that we can travel to, right? Yeah, I mean, you could ask, like, you know, why aren't they our counterparts too? Since they're exactly like us, except for one thing.
Would that bring into question degrees of similarity?
Yeah,
You mentioned that.
yeah. It certainly raises questions. Yeah.
I was wondering, how do you measure that, I mean, that possible one thing? So I'm thinking, when you had your frog example, in my mind, I'm thinking every instance prior to that frog anomaly, our two worlds would have been the same, is what you're implying, correct?
No, I wasn't.
Or-
I wasn't implying.
Okay, that's what I assumed, I guess, but, yeah, I assumed.
But you might argue that it would have to be that way.
It'd have to be that way until, you know, the instance the frog was there and then it had that split of two worlds. But we're still counterparts even prior to that, when it's exactly the same. Like,
No, we wouldn't be, because the worlds would be different. I mean, the worlds are these four-dimensional space-time things.
okay,
So
so it's still.
the world would always have been different, even if the frog just mysteriously appeared out of nothing. But if you're right that there had to be a difference in the prior history, like the frog had to be hopping over to this spot, whereas in our world it didn't do that. But then they would differ in even more, yeah, more
There's at
things.
least a
Yeah, there's,
spatial time thing, even if there's not a physical
Yeah.
difference? Okay.
yeah, the worlds are four-dimensional because we're following with the four-dimensional space-time continuum idea here. So, yeah. And you can also see that Lewis's theory has some really weird theological implications, which suggests that there's something profoundly wrong with the theory too.
Theological implications being
About
that
God. Yeah,
it's like
because,
God, well, not the Judeo-Christian God, just God as a concept.
well, the Judeo-Christian God, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that concept, yeah. God with a capital G. Here, look, so suppose for the sake of argument that God exists in some world, like the actual world, that there is a God, right? Suppose, right?
In our world.
Yeah, suppose there's a God, just for the sake of argument, right? Just a hypothesis to test the implications of the theory, all right? Now, God's supposed to be the greatest being, unmatched by any other being that exists. Right? God has to be the greatest, has to have matchless greatness. As St. Anselm said, God is a being than which none greater is possible. Mm-hmm. So God would have maximal greatness. God is maximally great. So then you're going to have to suppose that maximal greatness is an essential property of God, which on Lewis's theory means that God's got counterparts in every possible world who are just as great as God is, right? So now we've got like an infinitude of gods. We have polytheism, right?
That would be.
So, which is contradictory to God's supposed to be uniquely great, not just like, yeah. So it doesn't seem like Lewis's theory is free of theological implications, which a logical theory shouldn't have. Yeah.
Couldn't we also argue that like a single God could be so maximally great that it could manifest itself in all of these possible worlds?
Now remember, the worlds are like totally separate and isolated from each other, so you can't have like a single God who's like outside of all the worlds. God's got to be a possible being, so he's got to be in the worlds along with everything else.
He can't be in.
He can't be transcendent.
One singular substance or thing that exists.
They can't be
in all
things.
worlds.
They can't be things outside the worlds, and there can't be anything that
Because they're
exists.
concrete.
And there can't be anything that exists in more than one world. So you
Right.
can't have the same God in more than one. in multiple worlds. Each world is ruled by its own god,
Right.
who's exactly like the other gods, except for one little thing or other.
Yeah,
Like in
this
this
god
world,
is
he
totally-
created Adam and Eve, and in that world, he created Tom and Sally or something like that. Right? Because God has a creative choice.
Okay.
He's the supreme architect, right, of the universe. Right?
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so you wind up with the wrong number of gods.
Yeah.
It's a mess,
Something
right?
weird.
It's clearly not good. All right, so,
What if you went under just like no God?
well, yeah, then you don't get into trouble. But you don't want your theory of the possible worlds to like imply that there can't be a god. Like,
Yeah.
that doesn't seem
Just
right.
defeats everything.
Yeah,
Of the possible
it should be
world.
neutral. It should be neutral.
Yeah.
You shouldn't say, conceptualism like requires that there is a god. That was no good, right?
Right.
This one requires that there is no maximally great God. That's not right either. Not a unique one. Yeah.
Okay, so like just defending the idea of like if there would be a God in this underneath this theory, why would it be a problem if God is just he is maximally great, he has all the greatness available within that one world?
He does. Yeah.
And so
It's only a problem because
Because if there's other gods that are like his counterparts and they all have, like, say, the max.
they're just as real as he is, though, remember. They're not just imaginary beings. They're actual gods, right? So there isn't just one God who rules over all of reality. Instead, there's like a God for each
world.
each world a separate God. Yeah.
Doesn't work.
That's not what theism has in mind. It has in mind that there's one supreme ruler over all reality, not just over this space-time, but over all the space-time.
Transcendent.
Yeah. So,
Okay, yeah.
doesn't work. Doesn't work.
So within conceptualism, God is required, and then within combinationalism, where does God sit?
Doesn't say anything about that.
Kind of like up in the air. No conclusion.
It doesn't say anything about that. Yeah. It's basically presenting a naturalistic picture, so basic particles and combinations of them. But yeah, it doesn't seem like it is particularly conducive to the belief that there's a God either. But it doesn't seem to formally rule it out or rule it in.
So it's one of those neutral theories.
Yeah, which is fine. It
Okay.
should be neutral. So is the abstract worlds theory. Okay? So, another odd thing about Lewis's theory is that maybe there's some pressure having to do with Occam's razor, because not only do you have an infinitude of worlds, not only do you have an infinitude of these abstract worlds, right? You also have an infinitude of concrete objects, like a uncountable infinity of concrete things, right? Which seems excessive. Because you also have sets, like these worlds are sets. So you've got these abstract objects, an endless number, and also an endless number of concrete things. So yeah, you're getting rid of abstract things, but you're introducing a lot more concrete things.
Yeah. In a weird way.
Yeah. So yeah. All right. So let's move on to our next topic, which is the problem of universals. This is one of the major problems of metaphysics. The problem of universals. So one way of putting the problem is the question. One way of putting the question is: are there in the universe or in the world things in addition to concrete objects? Other entities that exist in addition to concrete individual things? Are there entities in addition to concrete individual things? Like Garfield, Felix, Morris, Rover, Fido, and Spot. All these. Are there things in addition to those concrete individual things? Are there entities in addition to or over and above these concrete individuals?
Dogness.
Well, yeah, Dogness in addition to Rover, Fido, and Spot. Katniss in addition to Felix, Morris, and Garfield, and so on. For example, does Katniss exist over and above Morris, Felix, and Garfield? And I'm assuming by Garfield, I mean an actual cat named Garfield, not like a cartoon cat. Right, because there was a cartoon cat named.
Also cartoon cat named Felix.
Right. But there are also like actual cats that are named that. Like flesh and blood, furry, purring, carnivorous cats. Right?
Oh, yeah.
That have those names.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So, what's meant by the term universal? In the Middle Ages, when they did a lot of philosophical work on this problem, they defined a universal as that which can be predicated of many. So they said, by a universal we mean that which can be predicated of many. Like Katniss. Katniss can be predicated of Morris, Felix, and Garfield.
But Morris, Felix, and Garfield could not be predicated of Katniss?
No.
Okay, that makes sense.
No, they can be said to instantiate or exemplify Katniss.
Okay.
So Morris, Felix, and Garfield exemplify Katniss, and Katniss is predicated of Morris, Felix, and Garfield. Predicated means the same as said of. So we can say Katniss can be said of Morris, Felix, Garfield, etc. Said of. Predicated of or said of. Whereas we can say that Katniss is exemplified by Morris, Felix, and Garfield. So they are examples of Katniss.
What would be wrong with identifying universals as categories?
Nothing.
So you said categories and universals?
They might be. Yeah. Some say they're concepts, some say they're sets or classes, others say they're universal.
Things.
Stuff.
Yeah.
That's stuff.
Now the thing you need to note though about this definition of a universal is that it's very neutral as to what exactly universals are. Yes, it can apply to something like Katniss, which is a property, the property of felininity. which can be exemplified or instantiated by Morris, Felix, and Garfield. But it could also apply, taken very broadly, to the word cat, to the concatenation of C, A, and T as linguistic objects. So take the word cat, the word, the symbol. Yeah. Now, that can also be predicated of many things. The same things, right? Morris, Felix, Garfield. So this gives you a linguistic interpretation of what a universal is. So this definition's a very broad definition. Anything from a linguistic item up to a Platonic form or Aristotelian quality can qualify as a universal under this definition. Okay. You could adopt a more restrictive definition. You could say by a universal, I mean a property which can be which is multiply exemplifiable. In other words, you might restrict universals if you are a mind to just properties, but that would assume then that there have to be properties in order for there to be universals. And that was in dispute in the Middle Ages. So in the Middle Ages, some called nominalists said that universals are words, and others said, no, they're properties. Okay, so if you view it as a property kind of thing, then you're going to want to define a universal as a shareable property. So some properties maybe aren't shareable, and they wouldn't count as universals. Like the property of being the first dog born at sea, something like that. Right? That property could only be had by
First dog born at sea.
just that one dog, yeah. And if there was a multiple litter born at sea, then there wouldn't be a first dog born at sea.
First dogs.
Yeah, but not first dog.
Yeah.
It comes out of the litter first, right?
No, it meant they plopped out at the same
At
time.
the same
Like the
time.
same time.
Yeah.
That was a process
Yeah.
of labor.
No, or if there were two different dogs that gave birth simultaneously.
Oh, that
Oh,
does
is that
fix
what
that
you mean?
problem.
On the same ship,
I
yeah.
mean, it
Oh,
fixes
wow.
the problem.
Yeah, this is
Right? Yeah, so that wouldn't count as a universal, even though it's a property.
Right.
But a property like dog would, because it can have many cases, yeah. Mhm.
So, with the property of being alive, would that be able to be shared
Yeah,
between entities?
yeah, yeah, like all of us are alive. Life is a universal, yeah.
Except for, like rocks.
That's a simpler answer that.
No, life is good, it's a universal. The only properties that aren't universals are these really odd ones that are defined to a single instance. They always have the word, they usually have the word "the" in front of them. Bertrand Russell pointed that out.
Yeah.
At the turn of the century, that if you put the word "the" in front of a description or build it into a property, then this can only be one and only one example of that.
The present.
Of that property. But if the underlying property is had by many things, then the property you've defined just isn't had by anything in that case. Like, if the property is being the first dog born at sea and two dogs are born at sea for the first time simultaneously, nothing has that property.
Or the present king of France.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's for a different reason. That's
Right,
because
that's for a different reason.
That's because nothing is a king of France.
Right.
If you say the cat, to be logically coherent, wouldn't you have to identify it with like a subletter or
Yeah.
something?
The cat?
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
So it's a singular?
yeah, I mean, you normally, when you say the cat, you mean the cat you're looking at or something like that.
Like
The
front
cat in
cat.
front of you, yeah,
Yeah. This cat.
yeah. Now, if there was just one cat in the universe, then you could just talk about the cat.
That, yeah.
Or would the word "the" be
But that's
necessary?
not the case. There are so many
Yeah,
cats.
there's a cat, not like the cat.
Yeah. Well, we do say the whale is a mammal,
Right, but there are more than one mammal.
and there's more than one whale, whatever.
Right, yeah.
Whales are mammals.
It's just a way of saying all whales are mammals.
Do you want to use with say duck cat or just say cat like you would with dog? Just cat. If you don't say the dog is in the room.
All right, so a universal can be that which is predicated of many, in which case something like the word cat could qualify. The other way of doing it is to say that by a universal we mean a shareable property. Okay, so according to realism, with a capital R, in this context, the realist maintains that there are universals. They're realists about universals. And by that they mean that there are shareable attributes or properties. The nominalists claim that there aren't any shareable properties. And many of these nominalists go so far as to say that only concrete individual things exist. An example would be the materialist who says that only bodies exist. They're nominalists. So they would say Morris, Felix, and Garfield exist. They're bodily entities, right? But there's no such thing as the catness that the realist claims to exist.
So they would reject Plato's theory forms.
Yeah. And also Aristotle's claim that catness is the essence of catness.
No essences.
Would they also reject categories just in general?
They might, but it depends if categories turn out to just be collections of concrete things, they might accept those.
Okay.
So there's the category of cats, that turns out to be a big collective of all cats.
Right, but that's different from catness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for one thing, yeah, catness is a quality and a collective is a collection, and
Right, like here's all the cats.
yeah, that's very different
Here's
than
all the cat
than-
properties. Okay.
they seem to be different kinds of beings. A collection of objects is a different kind of being than an essence or a quality of objects. On the face of it, they seem utterly different. Collections, for example, don't seem to have any particular unifying principle. That's certainly not true of something like catness. It seems about as unified a being as you could imagine. Right? But if you look at the totality of cats in the universe, there's no particular connection, it seems, between any of these cats.
What about mathness? What would a nominalist do with mathness?
Like arithmetic?
Arithmis.
Oh, the nominalist. That's something I wrote on for my project.
Arithmeticity.
Yeah, there you go, there you go. How does he handle that, being not concrete?
Arithmetic is a good like conceptual scheme of concrete things, but like doesn't really exist on its own.
Mhm.
It's a definition of concrete thing.
All right, so how might this be approached? Well, we could look first at the issue of paraphrase. Remember, I laid out some principles for doing ontology, right? And one of them was, can you take statements that appear to be about these entities and translate them into equivalent statements that don't refer to those entities anymore? So you make them go away. So let's start out with a very simple example. suppose we say dogness is exemplified by that barking thing. So this apparently refers to a universal, dogness, to this abstract quality. So the idea is that if there's a truth about something, then the thing that there's a truth about exists. And this appears to refer to dogness. So it appears that dogness exists. It also refers to that barking thing, right? So the barking thing must exist, right? We say there's a barking thing over there, and that's true, as opposed to it's being false. Like there isn't actually a barking thing over there. We're just assuming that there is. But if there were, right, then that barking thing exists, given the fact that it's true that it's barking. But here it's true that dogness is exemplified by the barking thing. So it seems like dogness should exist also.
Equally.
Yeah, given that the whole sentence is true, and that it appears to be about both the barking thing and its relation to dogness. So that's sort of the.
That would make it well formed.
So yeah, so this is what the realist says. It says therefore dogness exists. The nominalist is going to say, well, I can translate. I can translate this. Dogness is exemplified by that barking thing is just a fancy or a pretentious way of saying that that barking thing is a dog, and that the two sentences are equivalent. So he wants to say this statement, although true, says no more really than this statement. It's just a highfalutin way of saying that the barking thing's a dog. So we don't have to countenance dogness in order to communicate the basic information that's being communicated here, which is that dogness is exemplified by the barking thing. Okay. So that's the nominalist argument, that we don't have too much of a price to pay, in other words, to get rid of. What are we really losing? What we're losing is an entity we don't need, which is dogness. Right? Because you're positing a whole other category, right, of beings.
Right.
You're saying over and above dogs, there's also dogness. Now, why should we multiply categories of entities gratuitously unless there's really a need to have this category of dogness? Wouldn't it be simpler and more straightforward just to say that the barking thing is a dog? Yeah.
So there has to be some sort of thing in which we could say, like, Fido, Scooby-Doo, and Max are all dogs, right? So, like, there has to be some sort of unifying thing that makes them all dogs. Where I could say, like, canine and dog are a referent, or like two senses to the referent that is that thing. So, like, there has to be some sort of shareable thing that makes them all dogs, right?
Well, that's a different argument. Here we're just going from, here's a truth that appears to refer to a dog.
We're just doing, like, the language
Yeah,
part of it. Okay.
yeah,
That's fair. Okay.
yeah. I mean, there might be other arguments.
Right.
Like, we need dogness to explain
Dog.
X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
But that's not what's being claimed here. Here's being claimed we can read off the existence of dogness from the fact that there are truths about dogness that we want to affirm. And the nominalist is saying, you can't move that quickly. You've got to show that the truth indispensably has to refer to dogness. Otherwise, there's some important fact about the world that we can't communicate without referring to dogness. But all this tells us really, according to nominalists, is that the barking things are dogs. And that only refers to barking things and dogs, which are concrete entities. Those are concrete things, dogs and barking things. So they're saying to communicate the basic information that's being set out here, you don't need more than reference to concrete things. There's no sufficient reason for saying that we need to refer to abstract things like dogness as well. Remember, do not multiply categories of entities unnecessarily.
Right.
So they're saying it's not necessary, from this example anyway. So then the question moves on to, well, even if this sentence can be paraphrased away, can every sentence about universals be paraphrased away? Might not there be other examples that are more difficult to paraphrase? So consider this, dragonhood is unexemplified. So the realist would say, well, that's true, and therefore dragonhood must exist. Because it's true about it that it's unexemplified. So that's the realist counter to this. So, well, you translated that one. How about this one? Can you paraphrase this one? So what would the nominalist come up with? He would say, dragonhood is unexemplified. It's just a fancy way of saying
There are no dragons.
there are no dragons, right? So he would say, this is equivalent to there are no dragons, so we don't need dragonhood. This commits us to an abstract entity. This sentence doesn't commit us to anything. It just tells you there aren't dragons, committing you to neither abstract nor concrete things. So it's simpler.
In the nominalist, if a universal is
There are no
part of
dragons.
that barking thing, wouldn't the nominalist have to say that all barking things are dogs to fit the category of a universal?
No.
How can he identify just one if we're talking
Well, that's
about
what
universal?
the original sentence just said, that that barking thing happens to be a dog rather than like a walrus or whatever.
But that doesn't imply all barking.
No, it doesn't. So we're okay. Yeah, it doesn't imply that all barking things are dogs. Only that some are,
Or
which
at
is
least
true.
one.
Yeah, that one. Yeah. Okay, so there are no dragons, so we could do that one. Right? It seems like that's pretty plausible, right? It seems pretty plausible to say that dragonhood is unexemplified. It is just a dumb way of saying there are no dragons, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's going to fly.
Yeah.
And you have to know who you're dealing with here, right? You're dealing with a nominalist. He's not going to cut you any slack unless you can demonstrate a real need to talk about dragonhood. And this sentence doesn't do it. Maybe some other one does. All right. Next. We could try red as a color. And this is what the realist says, well, this is true. Matter of fact, it's a priori. We know that it's true, right? It's necessarily true. And the nominalist would say this is just a fancy way of saying that all red things are colored things, and that the two are equivalent, necessarily equivalent. All red things are colored things. So, looks like the nominalist is so far able to find equivalent statements that get rid of the abstract reference and replace it with a reference to concrete things. So that's the game, right? To replace any reference to what is abstract with references to what is concrete, and still have it come out to be equivalent. All right. Or we could now, the realist would say, well, I'll try this one though. Try honesty is a virtue. So how would we do that? Would it be all honest people are virtuous people?
Or could it be like the act of being honest is virtuous?
Yeah. Hold on. Let's do one at a time. All honest people are virtuous people. Okay, so that one won't work. It seems different than this case. And the reason being that this statement is true. Remember, they have to be equivalent. So it's true that honesty is a virtue, but it's false that all honest people are virtuous. Like, consider a extremely honest serial killer. Like, he always truthfully brags on like everyone that he's murdered, and always tells the truth.
Like a Hannibal Lecter?
Yeah. Yeah, he's very honest, but he's also like extremely vicious. Right? Yeah, so this would be false that all honest people are virtuous. They're not necessarily of the same truth value. That's odd, right? Yeah, so this translation's no good. So the nominalist didn't win yet, but he could try other translations.
Could you try the one that all honest people have the virtue of honesty?
No, because that refers to virtue. That refers to virtues.
Oh, shoot. Okay, yeah.
Virtues are abstract.
Yeah.
Virtuous people are concrete. So.
All honest acts are virtuous acts.
Yeah, let's think about that one. All honest actions. All honest acts are.
Oh, I can picture one
The
that's
Anne Frank in the basement kind of thing.
Hmm?
Oh, that's a good example.
What's the example?
I was saying it makes me think of the Anne Frank in the basement kind of thing. Like, it doesn't seem too virtuous, to be honest, in that scenario.
Yeah, the Jews are in
Ah.
the corner.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
right there.
I gotta be honest.
Are you harboring anybody? Yes. They're right there.
Right, so you see what he's saying? He's saying like
Yeah,
sometimes being a particular honest act might not be virtuous.
It's like very context dependent.
So again, this is going to be false, even though honesty is a virtue.
Could we say all honest acts
Good
are
example.
sufficiently virtuous acts?
What?
All honest acts are sufficiently virtuous acts? So they don't necessarily have to be virtuous, but they could be sufficient.
Honest acts tend to be virtuous.
Yeah, tend to be. That's a little bit. Yeah, right. Let's
There's
break
a
it.
presumption of virtue.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we can
Honest acts tend to be virtuous acts.
That seems like a matter of opinion.
Well, it's not clear that it's going to necessarily have the same truth value as the original one
Right,
in every possible world.
right.
Yeah. Well,
It seems like sometimes there might be some worlds where, like, whenever people are honest, it's like they're in the Anne Frank situation, and so honest acts don't tend to be virtuous in that world because it's such a rotten, miserable world. Yeah. So anyway, it seems like really hard. It seems like it's not so straightforward,
Yeah.
right? To be able to capture this one.
Well, you have to assume equality for realism to work, right? You have to assume that honesty and virtue are equal. If there's any inequality, then realism doesn't work at all. In other words, there has to be, if honesty is a virtue, then honesty equals virtue.
It doesn't. There are many other virtues.
Right. That's why I don't think realism works without equality between the two terms.
Yeah, but why can't there be why can't you say virtue is the overarching universal and there are many different virtues, bravery, honesty, intelligence,
That's-
versatility,
But that's
moderation,
Occam's razor ambiguity, right?
charitableness, empatheticness, being empathetic, right? So there could be many different virtues.
But to me, that's an ambiguous statement, saying there's many versus saying
Not sure what's
honesty is
ambiguous
virtue.
about it.
There's many colors, but, there's red is a color, there's many other things that are colors that are not red.
Yeah, like purple and green and so on. Doesn't mean that like color doesn't make any sense.
It seems that within realism, virtue just doesn't exist.
Right.
Because it's not a concrete thing, it's a label.
Virtuous
Some
people
type
might
of
exist.
act. But
Virtuous
you're labeling,
act.
to be a virtuous person, you must do virtuous acts. So you're giving, a descriptor to an act, but that's not a concrete thing.
Well, there is the alternative of saying that this doesn't really have any truth value at all.
That's what I feel. It just doesn't have truth value, it's not real.
You can have the prescriptive account, which says honesty is a virtue. It's paraphrased as be virtuous. Be honest, exclamation point. So all you do when you say honesty is a virtue, you're just promulgating a rule that you, the speaker, would like to be followed by people. You're not putting forth a proposition that has any truth value. You're just telling everybody to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, which would say that virtue ethics has no truth value whatsoever, right? It's a pure expression of our bossiness and controlling natures, right? So that'd be one way out for the nominalist, but that seems pretty severe. It seems like we want to say certain things are virtuous and other things are vices, right? Like thievery is a vice. Gluttony. Right. Yeah, so that's one example that you have of where the nominalist may get into somewhat of hot water in seeking to translate some of these everyday examples.
So when confronted with these examples, does the nominalist just say that virtue doesn't exist, or do they say that
Oh,
it's...
some say you can translate it like this, you can translate it like that.
Okay.
Yeah, virtue doesn't really, ethics has no truth value, so we can't use those examples.
Yeah.
We have to use examples like, say, from math.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's turn to math. So consider a simple example like some shape is exemplified. Okay, shapes are abstract universals, like round, square, triangular, right? So how would you translate that if you were the nominalist? Instead of talking about shape, you'd have to talk about objects which are
Have roundness?
well, it doesn't mention roundness even.
They're physical beings?
It doesn't tell you anything.
This is the problem. There's no such thing as a perfect circle in your life. There's no such thing as a perfect
Yeah,
geometric shape in
that's
your
okay. It has
So
some
it
kind.
doesn't-
It has some kind of shape.
All things are shaped things.
Yeah, So it just says some shape is exemplified would be translated as some object
A
is,
shaped dog.
some object is shaped.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
All right. Something is shaped. Okay, so that one they can do, right? But although it's true that some shapes are exemplified, whatever the shapes those are, right? Like the shape of this blackboard eraser. You may say, well, it's not a perfect rectangle, but it has some shape. I don't know, right? Whatever that is. Right. Yeah. So that one's easy enough. But what about the truth that some shape is not exemplified? In particular, some shape is never exemplified. And of course you can make it plural, but there's lots of them. The safe one of them. What might that shape be? Well, the shape, like the shape of a regular polygon with a googolplex of sides. Right, a googolplex is 10 to the 10 to the 100th power.
You can't, yeah.
And you could make bigger numbers easily. But that one's large enough because it really far exceeds the number of particles that science believes to exist in the universe. We can't even get close on that number. So you can't have, it seems like you can't have a googolplex-sided object. And another one would be a googolplex dimensional cube, which has a googolplex of like dimensions. Like not just 3 dimensions or 4 or 5, but like the googolplex analog of the cube. So that's never going to be exemplified either. So it seems like there'd be lots of good candidates for like these shapes that never get exemplified.
What about gases that take the shape of other objects?
Well, fine. Like I said, there aren't enough particles in the gases to like make those objects. Plus, we don't have all those spare dimensions running around as far as we know. You can't make anything more than 3 dimensions spatially, it seems, in our world right now. It seems pretty unlikely you'd get a world that has enough stuff in it to make a googolplex dimensional object. Yeah, that's not going to happen. Plus, there'd always be like a bigger one, right, that you couldn't have. Even if you, however many things you had, there'd always be a bigger one that you couldn't have. Right, because the numbers never run out. Yeah.
So, are you asking how the nominalist,
Yeah, how's he going to say that some shape is, what's that, what's the translation for that into concrete talk? So,
some shape is impossible?
he can't talk about shapes. He can only refer to shaped objects or to like round things and square things. So you can talk about round things and square things that have specific shapes, or you can talk about shaped objects which have no specific shape. But that's all he can use.
So things are impossible?
They're not impossible anyway. It talks about possible shapes, not impossible shapes. We're not saying that a round square is a shape. We're saying that like something with a lot of sides that you can't actually have in our world, it would be a shape, just not one that's exemplified. So, yeah, basically they can't say it.
The nominalist would have to say something like some things aren't shaped, which is
False.
yeah,
Impossible.
yeah. Well, if nominalism holds on to concrete.
Well, actually, they can do better. They could try this. Either, okay, no triangular object ever exists. Or no a square object ever exists. It's going to get very long. Or no pentagonal object ever exists. dot, dot, dot. So that's supposedly the way to capture this. You need the three little dots to indicate that you have to keep on going.
Sphere.
Infinitely. That's called ellipsis when you put three dots. So it means you have a series, like 2, 4, 6, dot, dot, dot. What's the next number in that series?
8.
Yeah, but how do we know that?
Because you put the 3 dots.
Yeah, but how do we know that 8's, how do we know what the pattern is? Well, because we see that there's a rule being followed. And what's the rule here?
Growth by 2.
Yeah, add 2 at each step. What's the rule here? Doesn't seem to be any way to state what that rule is, as far as I can see, except by saying that it's got to include every possible kind of shaped object, including ones that don't actually, right, exist. Okay, it's crucial that it include those for it to work. It's got to include the one like the Googleplex-sided object. Okay, but what's a possible kind of non-actual shaped object? Sounds like it's a universal. So I don't think you avoid abstract universals on this translation. If you're talking about non-existent possible kinds of shaped objects, yeah, those are abstract as you can get. Yeah, so that doesn't work. So by using the ellipses and the rule of expansion, you can get around the infinity of it. You stated it in finite terms, but only by bringing in abstract entities. Right? Okay, we could try this. We could try some object is possibly shaped differently than any object which ever exists. We're bringing in possibility now. Some object is possibly shaped differently than any object which ever exists. That gets you a lot closer. It's a pretty good translation. Ultimately, though, it's not equivalent to the original either. Okay. The equivalence, remember the original says there is some shape that is unexemplified. Okay. There are some possible worlds where there is some shape that is unexemplified will be true, and this will be untrue. One of those, imagine a possible world where the only shaped objects are spherical atomic particles, okay, spherical atoms that are incapable of changing their shapes. Okay, so in that world, no object is possibly shaped differently than it is because they're ultimate particles that can't change their shape. But it's still true in that world, since all the particles have the same shape, that there are plenty of unexemplified shapes, like triangles and rectangles. So all the things that exist are these ultimate tiny spheres that cannot possibly change their shape. Right? Then it'll be true that some shapes are unexemplified, but false that any of these objects can possibly change their shapes. So they couldn't be shaped differently than they are because they're ultimate atoms, Democritean indivisibles that are little spheres. So they cannot have different shapes.
So the negation is true as well.
Yeah. So that won't work as an equivalent, even though it gets us to in the neighborhood. but it's not equivalent to the original, so it doesn't meet the condition of equivalence. We still haven't found a way of saying some shapes are unexemplified. Though you can say this. This is the best I was ever able to do. Yeah, close but no cigar. A final one would be, is to use the element of time. Because it's true that objects can be shaped differently at one time than they are at another. So you could say possibly, here we're using possibly in front. This is de dicto possibility. The previous one was a de re possibility, a possibility of the objects being shaped differently than they are. Like this particle can be shaped differently than it is, but not an atom. They can't have different shapes than the shapes they have. This one says possibly later, so saying possibly later, right? There exists an object which is shaped differently than any object which exists earlier. Possibly later on, or in the future, if you like, there exists an object which is shaped differently than any object which existed before.
That
Yeah.
seems true.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but it's not equivalent to the original either, because it's actually a paraphrase of some shape has yet to be exemplified, not some shape is never exemplified. Doesn't tell you that some shape is never exemplified. It just tells you that there are some shapes that haven't yet been exemplified. If they get exemplified in the future, right, then it won't be true that they were never exemplified. And this doesn't entail that they're never exemplified. So it doesn't work either. That's the best I can do. Otherwise, you wind up with things like possibly there's a shape, there's an object shaped in a certain way which is never shaped in that way, which is a contradiction.
Ridiculous,
Yeah. So, yeah, that's the best you can do. So even turning to geometry away from ethics, it seems like there's a case to be made that there are untranslatable truths about the abstract realm. Maybe there are also some virtues that are never exemplified, like honesty. That's what Diogenes said. Remember that Diogenes with his lamp?
The honest man.
Yeah, looking for the honest man, which he could never find. Right? Yeah, that's what he was getting at. Right? That's what that parable is sort of about. Now, if we use the Lewis theory, we can translate this, but we have to make reference to Lewis's worlds. So we can say, using Lewis worlds, that in some possible world, there exists an object which is shaped differently than any object which exists in the actual world. And that will be equivalent. But how do you establish that these concrete Lewis worlds exist? And on that note, we shall bring today's lecture to an end.